Good morning. Get this to a normal height. Thank you all so much for being here and being here in person as well. It's great to be back in the Great Hall. For those of you who haven't seen us in a few years, thanks for coming back to Gallup's great office. And thank you all to those of you who are streaming in and spending a little extra time on Zoom this morning with us. Most importantly, thank you to the WGU team has really made this convening and this day possible. They've been great partners over the course of the past year as we've worked on two distinct research efforts that we'll cover here yet this morning. My name's Stephanie Markin. I'm Executive Director of Education Research here at Gallup, and I've had the pleasure of working with the WGU team now for, I think, 8 years in my most recent count in quantifying outcomes among their alumni population and really trying to help understand their total impact, not just the students they're serving, but to the greater U.S. economy. Today I'm going to share some key findings from our most recent research that we've conducted in partnership with WGU. Then I'll invite President Pulsifer to come and discuss how WGU is really scaling education and training beyond high school to a larger proportion of working learners. And then we'll hear from a WGU graduate himself. And then we'll finally transition to a panel-based discussion where we'll talk about some of the greater challenges that higher education is facing as an industry. And finally, we'd love to conclude the day with your good questions and comments and concerns. So please do be jotting things down throughout today's discussion and feel free to share those questions at the end of the conversation. I'm going to start us off by sharing just a little bit of details about the research that we've been engaged in over the course of the past year in partnership with WGU. We've really been conducting two distinct research endeavors in partnership with Western Governors University. The first of which is our alumni outcomes research, and some of you may be familiar with the work we've been conducting since 2013 related to the Gallup Alumni Survey, but for those of you who are a little less familiar, we've been engaged in a pretty unprecedented effort to try to quantify the currently enrolled student experience and graduate outcomes among those who have a four-year degree or higher since we first began that research in 2013. We've interviewed now just over 110,000 college graduates through that nationally representative study, the Gallup Alumni Survey, originally in partnership with Purdue University. And since then, we've had the benefit of working with individual universities as they seek to quantify their own outcomes based on that research. So in the National Gallup Alumni Survey, we ask a series of questions around the currently enrolled student experience, the extent to which students have access to a mentor who encourages them to pursue their goals and dreams, the extent to which they feel cared for as a person while enrolled. And then we also ask them a series of questions about their outcomes upon graduation. How long did it take for them to get a good job upon graduation or degree completion? Were they able to advance in their current role or get a promotion as a result of that degree? We also ask a lot of questions about their engagement in their work for those who are employed for an employer and even their well-being to really try to understand the extent to which graduates are achieving what we call a life well lived, one in which they're incredibly engaged in their work and that they're thriving in their well-being. Over the course of the last 8 years, we partnered with WGU to ask their graduates those same exact questions so that we could compare their results and their outcomes to a nationally representative sample of college graduates throughout the US, including those who were also attending large institutions, primarily studying online, as well as just all college graduates in general. So I'm going to be sharing research from our most recent iteration of that work in partnership with WGU based on about 1,000 surveys that we completed with WGU graduates who'd obtained a bachelor's degree from the institution more recently. And then we'll pivot towards talking about another distinct research effort that we've been engaged in over the past year. WGU gave us a really important and exciting mission over this past year, which was to quantify their economic impact and return to students for whom they'd served, as well as to the communities in which those individual graduates were living and their economic impact to the US economy in general. So we'll talk a little bit about that research. Now, we used a series of data sources that you see here on the screen in order to conduct that research. We used administrative data made available by WGU. We used our own Gallup Alumni Survey data that we've maintained over the course of the last several years, as well as data from iPads made available via the College Scorecard. We even used current population survey data and statistics to really try to understand the economic impact and return that WGU had made to these students. So I would say all of our research at Gallup, really over the course of the last 9 years in which we've been engaged in it and in partnership with WGU, has really centered around this pretty existential and important question that we've all been asking really since enrollments have declined and since costs have increased so significantly in the US, and that's, is it all worth it? Is getting a college degree and really any training and education beyond high school worth it, and worth it for those learners for whom are actually studying at these institutions? So we've asked this question a series of ways, and we've done this analysis a series of ways, but my favorite way in which we've asked this is directly to the consumer and to that graduate via a really simple question that we ask on a 5-point scale, where 1 means you strongly disagree and 5 means you strongly agree. We ask individual graduates through our Gallup alumni survey the extent to which they agree or disagree that their degree was worth the cost. And then we asked that same question of WGU graduates over the course of the last year. And you'll see here on the screen the results for WGU graduates as compared with all other graduates throughout the US, and even graduates of particular sectors of institutions. And you'll see here that 74% of WGU graduates strongly agree that their degree is worth the cost, according to our metric. And that compares with about 1/3 of college graduates nationally. So just about 1/3 believe that their degree is worth the cost. Now, it does get a little bit better as you get older, as you can imagine, right? People start to see the full value of their degree. But in general, we don't see great variation even between institutional category or classification, right? So if you go to a public versus a private, a large versus a small, even when we investigate this research by Carnegie classification or other codes or other subgroups of the total population, we really don't see differences. All the differences are really at the institutional level, and that's certainly the case for WGU graduates. So we've really tried to investigate this issue of cost a few different ways, and as you can imagine, most graduates who we interview and ask, was your degree worth the cost, are going through a series of different calculations as we pose that question. Now, of course, as you can imagine, first and foremost on their mind is how much they invested in order to obtain that degree, or how much their families or others invested on their behalf in order for them to be able to enroll at that institution. So we looked a lot at cost of attendance in the most recent research that we conducted with WGU on that issue of economic impact that they were providing to their graduates and to the greater US economy. And on that topic, we actually looked at total cost of attendance, the sticker price for individual students who obtained their degree between 2004 and 2020 at WGU. And in doing so, what we found is that a WGU graduate, on average, was spending about 63% the rate an average bachelor's degree student was having to spend nationally in order to obtain a degree somewhere else. Now, when you take the aggregate of all alumni who completed their degree during that time period, what we know is that results in about $1 billion saved in terms of total revenue and tuition having to be paid by those students. Now, of course, cost isn't the only consideration when you think about value of a degree and whether or not it was, quote, worth the cost. We also know that the total opportunity cost for so many students is a consideration when they answer this question, right? So they didn't just invest money, they also invested a lot of time in order to complete that degree. And that's particularly true for working learners who are having to make tremendous sacrifice in their personal and professional life in order to obtain additional education and training beyond high school. So when we look at WGU graduates, we find that they take about half the time as all graduates nationally in order to complete their degree. So there's a significant gain for them in terms of total time in order to complete. Now, of course, there are so many considerations, as I mentioned, when people answer this good question about whether or not their degree is worth the cost, right? There's the total that they invested, the opportunity costs associated with enrolling, but there's also the real calculation that they're engaged in about how much they will yield as a result of their degree, right? So what will their earnings differential be having enrolled in and completed a degree at WGU or really any institution? So we looked at the total earnings for an average individual throughout the US who had a high school degree or diploma or GED equivalent from their life from ages 38 to 64. Now, we selected 38 because we find the preponderance of WGU graduates are graduating in that time period in their lives. So looked at just those who are working in the total US economy, and we found that the average earnings from ages 38 to 64 was somebody who had just a high school degree or diploma or GED equivalent was about $700,000 over that period of time. Now, you compare that with a WGU graduate who had completed a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, and you see there's a significant earnings premium for those individuals who went on to obtain those additional degrees above and beyond what a high school degree or diploma would likely yield them in the market. Now, we know that it's not just about money, right? A life well lived is about so much more than just your earnings potential and just how much you return on your total investment, but a life well lived at Gallup means looking at well-being. We've been studying well-being really for the better part of the last 30 years before studying well-being was cool, given the pandemic. And what we found is there's natural fluctuation in well-being over time, right? We saw really significant and unprecedented fluctuation during the COVID crisis, and particularly throughout 2020 and early 2021. People who have additional education and training beyond high school are a little bit bouncier on that issue of well-being fluctuation. But we've studied well-being in partnership with WGU to really try to understand the extent to which their graduates are not just achieving significant and important economic returns based upon their degree and their experience at WGU, but also the extent to which they're achieving what we would call great well-being. Now, we measure well-being at Gallup using a two-part question. Some of you may have answered it before for us, where we say on a 0 to 10 scale, where 0 is your worst possible life and 10 is your best possible life, where do you put yourself now, and where would you put yourself 5 years from now? We use the combination of those two questions to assess the extent to which you're thriving, struggling, or suffering in your well-being and your overall life evaluation. What you'll see here is that 77% of the WGU graduates who we interviewed were what we would call thriving. And people who are thriving are exactly who you think they are. They're experiencing significant gains in their professional and their personal lives. People who are struggling are just kind of getting by, and people who are suffering are really falling behind. You'll see there's a significant difference between WGU graduates and the greater US adult population on this issue of thriving and well-being. Now, there are a few ways in which we know you can maximize the chances of graduates, quote, thriving in their well-being and also feeling engaged in work upon graduation. And one of the most important ones that we've uncovered through our Gallup alumni survey work is this issue of mentorship, and particularly having a mentor who encourages you to pursue your goals and dreams. Now, when we interview college graduates nationally, we find very few of them are actually experiencing a high-quality mentorship experience. Essentially, a third of all US college graduates report they had that mentor while enrolled in obtaining that additional degree and above and beyond their high school diploma. What you'll see at WGU is we had a far higher percent strongly agreed that they had a mentor who not just encouraged them, but encouraged them to pursue their goals and dreams, a slightly higher bar at 63%. Now, I'm going to leave it there because there are so many more insights packed into the reports that you're able to download. With that, I'm going to turn it over to President Pulsifer, who will share a little bit more about how WGU is working to address this issue of scaling education training beyond high school to a higher proportion of working learners.
My wife, who's about the same height as Stephanie, would say that this podium was a design flaw. She probably was right, Stephanie? This is great for me. It's great to be with all of you. Also, so grateful to Stephanie and also Gallup for hosting us here, and also for being a partner in helping all of us maybe think a little bit differently about higher education and its core mission, its value proposition, everything else. And I think that's what I'm asking all of you to do, and we hope that actually by holding ourselves accountable to actually delivering on the value proposition that we see that is fundamental to the promise of higher education, and our willingness to measure it, our willingness to actually see whether or not we're delivering on it, that may help all of us to start kind of rethinking how we approach the design, the delivery, the affordability, all aspects of education, and how do we best advance the future of it. And so each year we're certainly very grateful to partner with Gallup to really look at how our alumni are doing. This is directly tied to one of our 3 key results, which is return for graduates. That is 2 of our 3 key results. Our first is completion, our second is return for graduates, and our third is equity. That's rooted simply in this notion that the promise of higher education is that it is the surest path to opportunity. That if you can acquire the knowledge, skill, and ability, you put yourself in a position to live a self-determined life, and that we should be able to measure that effect. And I think that ability to think differently really means that you're putting the individual student at the center of everything that you do in higher education, and we want to make sure that, in fact, we're delivering on that promise. And it's incredible to actually think that our graduates from the first one in the year 2000 to today, that we've been able to help them realize over $460 billion of economic value, $261 billion more than they would have otherwise. When you saw the individual numbers there, the other thing that stood out to me is that's also from the age of 38. That even when you're 38 years old, there is a prospect of prosperity and progress and advancement, and that promise is there regardless of the age that you are. It's kind of still core to this simple notion that there's inherent worth of every individual, and if given the opportunity, each of us has something big to contribute, and so how do we make that possible? That number of graduates, as you know, as it continues to slope upwards, so will the scale of our impact. But regardless of that scale, one of the things that is truly fundamental about WGU is that we put the individual student at the center of everything that we do. We have a cultural belief that we use called 1 by 1, that we solve for the individual student and we advance outcomes 1 student at a time. When I talk about thinking differently about higher education and some of this research that's being done, one of the simple notions is to kind of dispel this idea that somehow selectivity or exclusivity or who you admit is more important than how do you expand access to every single human. that you can recognize that even when you have 300,000, that you keep adding 50,000 more to that, and hopefully 60,000, 70,000, et cetera, that all of their lives change, each and every one of them. That in no way is there a limitation as to how much value can actually be created. And it's just fascinating to me that to recognize that, in fact, opportunity expands when you have more people participating in it. And that in no way should we limit those who can actually access these pathways to help them change their lives for the better. Gallup's research does pay particular attention to how our alumni are thriving their lives in every aspect of well-being, not just financially, but emotionally, physically, socially. And our bachelor's degree alumni report certainly shows that the highest levels of thriving at a rate 27 percentage points higher than American adults without a degree. That's incredible. And that's almost, if you think about it, 50,000 individuals who wouldn't be thriving but are. And that doesn't even consider their families, their colleagues, their friends, their associations around them who also are secondarily benefiting by their education. Scale does matter. It matters a great deal. Last time I checked, we have about 330 million individuals in the US. Every single one of those individuals matters to us. Every single one of those individuals is contributing and participating in our communities, our society. It's like, that does matter, but at our core, that, the primary focus and our primary customer is that one person, and we're driven first and foremost by that one-by-one impact. Lastly, I'll just kind of share before I welcome Tony up here, is that over the course of our 25 years, I just want to highlight something that's happened and it is accelerating that we're quite excited about. In the first 20 years, since the year 2000 until 2017, which was our 20th anniversary year, we had reached nearly 100,000 alumni. We were 97,000 and change. But just in the last 5 years, that number will exceed 300,000 alumni. So in 5 years, we've more than doubled the amount of graduates that we had in the first 20 years. And that, to me, is like this notion of how do you really accelerate the impact that you can have, and how do we maybe start really recasting the measures of quality and value in higher education. Okay, so with that said, is now my pleasure to introduce one of our special students and these special humans, WGU graduate Tony Rivera. Tony holds a bachelor's degree in information technology, network design, and management from WGU. His interest in software development and enterprise design began early in his career at America Online. Some of you may have heard of that. We're all old enough to have known that one. AOL. After 20 years in the field, Tony now serves as CEO of Airtech Incorporated, a data science and software development firm servicing government and commercial clients. In addition, he is a technical strategist with discipline in network infrastructure and architecture and continuity of operations design with experience in several application development languages. So we're grateful to have him here and give you a sense and the flavor of the students that we serve at WGU. So come on up, Tony.
Morning, everybody. Glad to be here. Also glad to be in a full suit. It's usually shorts and, playing the part on the Zoom. So I'll start with my story. It's a short one, but it's my story. So about 2 years after 9/11, I worked as an engineer at Sprint. Got laid off. Industries were going, in disarray after what happened that day. Got a job at a network operations center, actually, and was doing networking and low-level software development. One night, I hear this voice, a loud person, and, got to know the gentleman by the name of Marcus Hutchison, and he's also an alumni. About a year working together, Marcus leans over, and he's comfortable with me, and he leans over, he goes, "Why are you working here? Why are you working here?" And I'm like, well, this is my job, right? I have my job. I have a young family. And he's like, where did you go to school? I was like, well, I never got to finish. I started community college, and I just got wrapped up in life, and I wasn't able to get done. And he's like, well, you should look into the school I went to. I have a master's. I'm like, you have a master's? You're like 3 or 4 years younger than me. How is that possible? He was like, they make it really flexible for you. You should really look into WGU. So I took him on that and looked at WGU and what they had to offer, and I was like, man, this is too good to be true. And I'm like going to the screen because I'm like, I got to find the gotchas here. Like, all right, it's like $1 million. Like, what's going on here? Long story short, I got in there and then registered, got issued a mentor. Mentor went through my plan and talked to me about my life, what are my goals, and just really had this well put together plan for me. And I'm like, man, this is really neat. And the person made it like they really cared, and I felt that. And, went along with the process and got to know the mentor got to know me. And, just like with life, there was ups and downs, so I had to, push the schedule left or right, tighten the aperture whichever way it needed to be, and was able to go through the program. But what's great about the program is the moment I started, going back to Marcus introduced me to government contracting, and it was all because I got my education at WGU. Was I able to even start working with him and get a government clearance and start my path in government space. And from there, had a great career working with government and worked for presidents and secretaries of states and all that fun stuff. And then finally I had the crazy notion to say, you know what, let me start a business. And going down the rabbit hole of starting a business, there were all these requirements. Education was one of them. And it was right when I graduated that I decided to do this. So the timing just all worked out. And in that process, instead of starting when I bought one, so I circumvented a lot of stuff. But the application to go after different contracts, the owners are required to have an education, right? If you want to go after a certain type of work. And my space is Intel and cybersecurity, that type of stuff. And with WGU and their program, I was able to finish, get my college education, start my business. And today, after 11 years of owning Aerotech, we're doing very well. We're one of the leading companies in our space with, software development and data analytics. I like to tell people that if you pick up the Wall Street Journal and you see people like Bernie Madoff get arrested, it's actually our software that they're using to protect our markets. So I'm very proud of that. But it all couldn't happen with the first steps of going through WGU and its mentorship program and really making it flexible for the individual. I tell everybody who doesn't have a direction, if the brick and mortar is not for you, go to WGU, and that sounds like a rap there, but it's true, and it really helped me propel my career, and I'm always grateful, and I try to give back as much as I can. So that's my story with WGU, and I'm very proud of it, and I'm hoping to do more of these and be in front of people and talk about WGU, which I'm really proud of. So with that, Stephanie, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony. With that, we'll turn it over to the panel-based discussion. So I'd love to invite our great panel, President Pulsifer, Brandon Bastide from Kaplan, and will be moderated by Paul Fain.
Hello, hello, okay. Hi, good morning, thanks for being here. Good to see you. We're gonna do a 20 minutes or so, 20, 25, and then I'll turn it over to the audience for questions, so be thinking. And I think that goes for the folks online as well. And I know I did hear among the people watching is an 8th grade class looking into career options, so that makes me a little more nervous. This is serious stuff here. I'm not going to introduce our panelists. You know who they are. Just going to get right into it. A couple things hit me about Tony's excellent story. Word of mouth and flexibility. And I think about this this moment of just really an enrollment collapse in American higher education. Scott, your numbers are impressive. Last I saw, enrollment was over 200,000. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think in the last academic year, we served over 200,000 students, yeah.
So what's working? And I mean specifically for working adults who are passing up community college or, frankly, in some cases, jobs.
Well, I think there's many things, but I think there's probably 3 core things I would say. First and foremost, like Tony's story tells us, is that we do endeavor to design curriculums and programs and credentials that are directly relevant to opportunities that they want to pursue. And that's not to say that we aren't investing in liberal education too. It's just saying that we want to ensure that the learning outcomes of the programs that we offer are directly relevant to the skills and capabilities that they need to acquire and attain the opportunities that they're pursuing. That's the first, for us, really important, is to say they have to be relevant to the opportunity they're pursuing. Arguably, one of the first questions we ask our prospective students is like, well, what do you want to do? The next question is then which program might be right for you. The second key differentiator I think we have is also exemplified by Tony's experience, which is when you're serving a working learner, by the way, that's regardless of age. A working learner is a better description of someone who actually already has a lot of demands on their time, such that the flexibility is one of the most important value propositions of the educational model. And if you think about their choices as to whether I can opt into one that is at a set time, I have to show up in a classroom on a campus, or I can consume the content of learning resources when it fits my schedule. I can engage with my faculty and my course instructor when I'm available, and we can schedule that. When we present a model by which all of the mentoring and the support and all the kind of consumption of the learning is done around their already busy schedule, that is an incredible differentiator for us. Lastly, the low cost. I mean, when you think about the ability to pay a much lower cost and finish it in a shorter time, it's enabling them to actually attain the opportunity, which is what they came for in the first place. I sometimes think about how daunting telling someone that says, this is a 4-year journey you're gonna be on. Like, I can't wait that long, especially if I'm early 30s. So those are some of the things that we think are working.
It's a formula that makes sense, but one that just isn't happening for a lot of other institutions. Brandon, you're no stranger to these issues or this stage. I wondered if you could give us a sense, beyond WGU, when I look at the enrollment numbers of who's doing really well, it's similar models. Southern New Hampshire, ASU Online. Can you give me a sense, beyond WGU, what seems to be the model that's working right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've heard a lot of pieces of that and what Scott has mentioned and in the data that Stephanie reflected. I would summarize it in a few simple ways. These are incredibly student-centric institutions that are employer and market responsive. And that's, by the way, I think, the opposite of where most R1 and elite universities are, which are primarily faculty-centric and government responsive, meaning trying to drive government research wins, right? And then I think there's other components of it that are really important. Growth is part of the mission of those institutions. They desire to grow. It's clearly stated in what they're trying to do. And this is the really critical second part to that. They view growth as improving quality, not lowering it. And that too is the opposite of most elite-minded institutions and residential institutions. They might want to grow on the margin, an extra 50 students here, another 100 there, but it's not inherently part of their mission, and they think about growth as cheapening or lessening quality. And the irony is that you've seen the opposite with these other models.
I want to stick with you for the follow-up, and then we'll get to Scott. To me, I'm struggling to see why there aren't more imitators, to be honest. There are different models for different students in different segments of American higher ed. You can't generalize about anything, but with your work with Kaplan, you're working with research universities that do take the working learner population very seriously. I wonder, what does it take for a University of Montana to take the leap, and why aren't more doing it? And for folks who don't know, Montana is working with Kaplan on a couple working learner-related projects, but really trying to open access to some non-traditional students.
Yeah, look, I mean, this is going to sound really simplistic. It takes brave leadership at these types of institutions. You've got boards of trustees. You've got alumni who are beholden to the idea of what the institution was, right? And you've got a lot of constituents who are pulling it and pushing it in different ways. I just step back and look at some of the crazy examples happening out there that the public perception of higher education is skewed around all this too. I mean, the University of Texas right now is making $6 million a day from oil because they own and control 2.1 million acres in the Permian Basin. University of Nebraska, I know there's a lot of Nebraska-connected fans here at Gallup, right? Scott Frost was fired, he got a $15 million severance. If they had waited 2 weeks, it would have only been $7.5 million. Like, people hear these stories, right? And you're like, oh, these universities have all this money, but they're also distracted, many ways, from the core mission of student centricity, market responsiveness, things like that. So you think about a Seth Bodnar, the president of Montana. That is a brave, bold leader who has been able to, with resistance, right, get faculty and boards of trustees and governors behind the work that they're doing. It's not easy, right? So it takes that bold leadership to kind of break out of it. And even then, it's quite a difficult job.
Yeah, I second what you're saying. I hear from a lot of university presidents who generally agree with all these points, and yet you just don't see it happening as much as you would think, frankly, given the success of WGU. Scott, you talk with a lot of your peers. I mean, I don't think you're about to start a football team anytime soon. And if you
want to stay undefeated, as I like to say.
But when you talk with folks, what seems to be the big barriers for institutions putting their brands out in competition with you?
It's a really long list, meaning that for a century, especially for the last half century, we've invested in a lot of things that have buttressed the conventional model of higher education that we have in the U.S. And so there are some institutional things about that: faculty shared governance, credit hour, regents, the very diversified mission of these institutions, the revenue associated with all those different operations. There's a sense that structure exists just even with the institution, that it is so difficult to trade off something that you already have for something that's unknown and risky. And that may be something as simple as revenue that's being generated from real estate investments you have, et cetera, to how do I abandon that to actually focus investments on things that will dramatically alter the mission and value proposition of the institutions. But there are also things at a regulatory level and an accreditation level that even accreditation itself, mind you, many of you who know me, you know my background is not higher education. In the first year, we had our 7-year review visit with our creditor, which the whole thing was so foreign to me, to have someone basically come and evaluate whether you look like and do things like everyone else such that we can deem you to be of quality. And I'm like, that thing supports a conventional model. If you think of the student finance complex that exists around higher education, it supports a conventional model because the rules that are on the books are, do you have a credit hour? Do you have terms? What's the full-time eligibility? Does your program have, like all these rules to say those things are actually designed to keep the status quo, such that when you actually are working with a bold leader and courageous one, is like, it doesn't always mean that they're going to be successful because you have to run through all those other things to be successful. So in WGU's case, we did have the benefit that we were starting from the ground up, that we had no other barriers, and you had to have a really good leader like Bob Mendenhall to go damn the torpedoes, basically. We're going to figure out how to do this differently, and we start with something that Brandon also mentioned. We're going to start with doing everything for the student. That is, we are totally 100% absolutely clear about who our customer is in higher education. We serve students because it's for them that we're trying to deliver on the value proposition of education. I think that's also, by the way, what the student finance, federal aid system also believes, that we're underwriting this whole thing that's supposed to serve students, and yet we've packaged this massive complex revenue model in most institutions, of which the majority of that budget is not delivering value to the student. And so that is really hard to break through for most institutions. And the ones that do it, like Purdue Global, is the Kaplan partner, they do it outside of that conventional thing, and kudos to that, because we need more of it.
Do you think you'll see more of it in the next couple of years?
I sure hope so. I am encouraged by the fact, honestly, that some of the public institutions are actually finding the innovation that existed within a for-profit sector that was persona non grata in higher ed, and we get all the reasons why. But there's something about just saying we got to disrupt this centuries-old convention that exists. I certainly hope so, because like I said earlier, opportunity only expands when you have more people participating in it. If we can shift our mindset away from rankings and selectivity and research only to how are we expanding dramatically our ability to enable individuals to acquire the knowledge, skill, and ability they need to change their lives. We need all of them participating in our economy, our society, everything else. The more we can shift and pivot our mindset to that, the better off all of us will be.
I'm going to come back to you, Scott, in a second on costs, but first, Brandon, looking at the environment now, I mean, I feel like pre-pandemic, the discourse around working learners, the adult student, the non-traditional student, was very focused on cost, price, primarily. I think the pandemic helped lay people like me see time was another one that we were maybe underestimating how stretched folks are. But, coming into this strange moment we are now, what's your sense of the price sensitivity of the working learner and how much they're shopping around to get the best value?
Yeah, look, I think price matters for most prospective higher education consumers, right? Traditional age students, right? The working adult population, and if you look at some of the trends that are happening in the space, right? One interesting story that I think is developing, and you can see it, I'm pretty sure, in WGU numbers, UMGC, some of the others, is a growing number of traditional age students turning to institutions like WGU, right? Not a story that's really been paid careful attention to, but the point is the model is starting to attract traditional age students who are looking for faster time to completion, more flexibility because they want to do things like work while they're going to school, live at home, save money, take care of a family member, right? All these drivers. So one interesting trend to watch is that this is now a model that's becoming more and more attractive to everybody who's thinking about higher education. And at the end of the day, the big challenge we have is that the cost of higher education has just continued to spiral out of control. And I think it's a big reason why we have so many sessions about, is it worth it? Is it worth it? Higher ed tuition's gone up some 420%. I don't know what the latest, but 400+% since the early 1980s. That's double what healthcare has gone up in that same period of time. And we all know that healthcare costs have spiraled out of control. There's just very little excuse for it. And I think we need to get to the place where we are working to actually lower the cost of higher education, not just, kind of keep it flat or, the 3.5% annual increase, how can we drop that down? People are incredibly ROI sensitive now, meaning they're looking at the whole thing. How much is it going to cost? How much time is it going to take me? And what is going to be the economic impact on the other end? This is happening across the board. I think we're looking at an ROI generation, even among traditional age students and parents of traditional age students.
Well, on the traditional age student piece, I remember, I think it was Scott actually giving me a tip of maybe look into what's happening with this last class of graduating high school students who became accustomed to online learning. And in this environment, some intrepid journalists out there should look into those enrollment figures for that class. Scott, I remember years ago, a really great report looked at the financial models for CBE programs and found that many other institutions were trying to emulate your price point and struggling. Too small scale, different type of student, couldn't deliver at that price point. And, obviously your tuition levels are incredibly affordable. Can other institutions do that without your scale? I mean, your scale is growing very rapidly too. Just give us a sense of the interplay between scale and price for you.
I do know this is that Dave Groh, when I joined, he's now been with us 17 years, but so about 15 years ago, he was telling me that when he joined, there was only like $1 million in the bank with WGU. We had just kind of got to a point to where we were, if you will, cash flow break even, to where we could truly get over a scale or a threshold that becomes self-sustaining on tuition alone. It is possible But I think you have to, again, separate and isolate the unit economics of delivering online competency-based education with shorter lifetime value of student because they're finishing in 2.5 years, not 5. And so if you have fewer terms of tuition to deliver a value proposition, then you also have to make sure your cost of delivery match to that revenue or lifetime value per student. And there is a threshold of fixed costs that you do have to then get over. That can be relatively low, but it's also investing in things that most traditional institutions haven't invested in. For example, technology. Technology is easily for us 10 to 12% of our operating budget and costs. But we don't have facilities that are only utilized at 10 to 15%, by the way. So we don't carry all those costs. We don't carry also high administrative costs. Like, you have to keep the fixed costs really low such that you're basically managing your unit economics to where you self-sustain. Can other institutions do that? They certainly can test it. One other dynamic I think I would add that's also different at WGU is we do not charge per credit. We charge per term. And so in that term, you can complete as many credits as you want. And so when you look at what the median kind of credits finished per term that our students are doing, our kind of cost per credit to a student, that is, so our price per credit to a student is somewhere between $175 and $250. Most institutions are charging somewhere between $650 and $850 per credit. So they have a lot of revenue covering who knows what costs. And we're going like, oh no, you have to run something profitably. And by the way, we also are very mission driven because even at a net level, we only run at about a 2 to 5% net margin to be self-sustaining. Not 20%, 2 to 5%. And so that's very different. One thing that I want to test with Stephanie, who's done this research too, because there is something that connects what Brandon was saying to the value for students, because if I can recall, the question on was it worth the cost is a really, really important question that impacts whether or not you have a high NPS and a high referral rate among your alumni. Because I believe if a graduate answer was it worth the cost, they were something like 6 or 7 times more likely to recommend their alma mater to friends and colleagues, et cetera. If I'm not mistaken, it's something like that. Worth the cost is really, really important for graduates.
Yeah, it's so important. I mean, to Tony's earlier point, right, that recommendation that he got to obtain additional education training beyond high school at WGU, if not for a great experience, if not personally for feeling like that was valuable, probably never would have gotten that recommendation or proceeded. And I will say, even for traditional institutions who I think maybe underestimate the importance of that metric, it also has a huge impact on your willing to donate back to your alma mater, right? So as you think about long-term giving and even long-term volunteerism, like what Tony's engaged in this morning, that's really important in terms of building that alumni base and actually getting them to give back to the institution. I think that gets lost.
Do you, just quickly for Stephanie to start, Scott too, I mean, do you think the adult working learner, your typical student, might be more amenable to a word-of-mouth sort of recruitment than typical online marketing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do know that even a traditional age student is being influenced by word of mouth. It's just the mouths are all their own household. And so, where did my parents go? So it's like, and so I actually think word of mouth and that influence is really, really high. I do know at WGU, because of worth the cost, because of mentors, I think that was the second biggest influencer on word of mouth. About 70% of the new students at WGU are referred to WGU. Back to the cost point, by the way, is that actually allows us to keep our student acquisition costs really low when you have that kind of high referral rate. I certainly think that it may be weird to think of it this way, but students as consumers of education, I think at the core of every decision we make is an economic trade-off. And I think they are weighing like, well, what is the economic value proposition here? And I'm gonna go get information about that, and that includes people that have had experiences with WGU. And when you have 300,000 alumni out there and you have a large network of employer partners and community college partners, et cetera, you're like, that word of mouth certainly is gonna benefit WGU.
I think you asked a really important question earlier, Paul, which is what could institutions adopt from what WGU has done successfully in order to build this really engaged alumni base and also get those great referrals that Scott mentioned? I think one key part of what they should consider adopting in a more compulsory way is the mentorship piece of all of this. And you heard a little bit about it in Tony's presentation, right? As he said, immediately upon enrollment, I received a mentor. That wasn't like something that just happened to happen, right? That was compulsory in his experience at WGU. And I think at a lot of institutions, that's a happenstance, right? If you find somebody who's really excited to encourage you and be this great mentor, many of us in this room probably can recall their first, last name, and maybe their phone number. They have a huge impact on your life long term, but that's kind of something that might happen to you, not necessarily going to happen. I think about my own experience when I was at Elon University. I had a major advisor assigned to me. I was an undecided major. I went to declare my major with him. I said, I'm going to be a business student. And he said, why do you like business so much? And I said, I really don't, but I need to have a job when I leave here. And he said, don't do that. Like, do something you love and it will work out. And if not for that, I never would have actually studied political science and enrolled in the polling center and figured out I love public opinion research and what strangers will say to you on the phone. And it's just a really simple example, right, of like a change in total trajectory that was one conversation, but I just kind of got lucky in that conversation, right? He just happened to be somebody who was a little more invested than the average faculty member who's probably assigned random students who won't be in their field of study long term. I think that was a happenstance and a coincidence. If we had that as a compulsory step, right, on day one at X institution, if somebody asked you, what do you want to do when you leave here and what do you really love? I think that's a game changer for so many students.
Absolutely, and something that we're hearing more awareness about, and polling has shown that students who are satisfied with their college experience, number one factor is that connection to a faculty mentor. And if WGU can do it at scale, it must be doable. So I want to talk ROI here quickly, and then we don't have a lot of time before opening up for questions. But Brandon, you mentioned that we're here in an ROI-focused environment. I would agree with you. That said, as somebody who writes about it, it's still a very provocative idea in a lot of higher ed and beyond. I think there's more bipartisan agreement in states and here in Washington that colleges should be held accountable for their graduate success in the job market than some people in higher ed estimate. But the counter argument being, we don't control the economy. We can't necessarily determine student success. What's your take? How fair is it to hold colleges accountable based on that?
Well, I think there's a couple different ways to think about it, right? One is why are we holding them accountable? And you heard Scott talk about WGU's motivation for this, which is to really understand how well we are serving students. And you have to be continuously curious about that because it's an ongoing formula that I don't think we've fully maximized, right? I remember having a conversation with a faculty member who had been on the faculty of a prestigious institution for 25 years, and he taught research design, right? And we were having this lunch conversation, and he said, I'm having a real crisis, because he said, all my life I've taught people how to do rigorous studies to really, test a theory or an idea or prove an outcome, and he's like, and I realized that in my own teaching over almost 3 decades, I have no way to prove that I was a good teacher. And I just sat there with that and thought, holy bleep, right? Because I think it's essentially where a lot of higher ed is, if we sit back and honestly evaluate that. So yeah, we can hold people accountable because we're delivering billions of dollars of federal financial aid to support these institutions. There's different layers of that. I think the fundamental reason why we should care about accountability is for the curiosity part of, are we actually doing a better job serving students? What are the drivers of doing a better job of serving them? And this is, what is being unpacked by some of the new models that are student-centric, right? And by research like what Gallup has been doing to really say, okay, what matters the most of all these things, right? Is it going to the football game? Is it living in a residential facility? You can go down a long list of stuff. So I would love to see more institutions come to that question through the curiosity lens. And that's actually the most shameful part, because you would think that academically rigorous individuals, right, who have gotten to the top ranks of these institutions as provosts and presidents and whatever, right, would be naturally intellectually curious about their own impact of their institution. I don't see that, right? I just don't see it. So that's the disappointing part of where we are right now.
Thanks for that, Scott. Happy to have you weigh in on the fairness of being measured on ROI, but I did want to ask as well, what do you do in terms of intentionality at WGU to align your programs to labor market demand? And you know, how much work goes into developing the sort of numbers for your graduates that you showed today?
Yeah, well, there's a theoretical thing that may be a little harder to explain, but that is simply that we do take a skills-based approach, meaning that you have to identify what really are the skills that are needed in the opportunities and those roles that exist out there in different workforce sectors with different employers, et cetera. And when you take that skills-based approach, you're actually starting a unit of measure or unit of design within the curriculum itself that's much more granular than, hey, I want to teach a course on digital marketing. Like, well, what is it that the individual is supposed to be really competent at if you teach such a course? And when you start thinking about trying to answer that question, you can then better map the learning outcomes to what are the skills that are actually needed. And then when you underpin that with a achievement wallet and a transcripting model that's more skills-based, you can also surface value to the student while they're going through the courses and the programs, meaning that now that you've completed this course, you're proficient and competent in these particular skills. And these jobs in your specific geolocation are available to you. And this is the incremental pay that is now accessible to you because you possess these skills. So I think in the design, we're always figuring out is like, what is it that we really have to assess your proficiency in to deem you competent for the opportunities you're going to pursue? That is a level of design granularity that I think we benefit. Now, we also do that by having a large program advisory groups that are represented by employers. We partner with the likes of Lightcast, formerly MZ Burning Glass, and others, or even with Department of Labor Statistics, et cetera, to say, where are those things that are emerging as skill sets that we need to design into our curriculum? I'll tie this back to something else, which is, if you actually focus on the economic value proposition as well as the core ones of education, you even think about liberal education design differently. What are the skills that you're learning in the liberal education or those general ed courses, et cetera, that you actually have to possess that make you better skilled for the jobs you're going to pursue? Versus just leaving it to that individual to figure out later how you're going to find a job, even if you pursued a degree in a language or humanities or psychology or whatever else. There's ample data from, again, our friends at Lightcast to say, if you just thought about designing those programs with maybe like 10 to 15% added skill sets around analytics or statistics or other things like that, you so dramatically increase the job readiness of a degree holder in the liberal arts. That would be incredible for all the institutions to do that, to take more accountability for that. Lastly, I would say is like, why in the heck are we not listening to our customers in the first place when over 70% of them are always saying that I went to college in the first place to get a good freaking job? No, that's not why you came here. You're wrong, you're confused, that's not why you're going to college. You're coming here to be a good citizen, to have a great emerging adult experience, whatever. You're like, why did we just ignore all of that instead of saying, man, that's really fundamental to why you're here, and I'm going to add on to it. But I'm going to make sure we deliver on that core value proposition because I do think it's factoring into their choice making is it worth it? And if I'm now recognizing that thing costs way more, I think it was even Scott Galloway who said during the pandemic when all of a sudden the emerging adult value proposition got sidelined because everyone got sent home and all it came back to was education. He's like, that's a really expensive education if I don't get all of the social life with it. And that's a good way to think about it. It's like, how much are you paying for that versus how much are you paying to actually acquire the knowledge, skill, and ability you need? That, I would say, that's actually behooves each and every one of us who are trying to reinvent higher education to think about that.
I've got to think that the number, that 70% threshold, is even higher for the students who are sitting out higher ed right now and who don't really want the emerging adult experience. All right, so I've talked too long. Questions from you all. Please go ahead, and I think a microphone will be brought to you. Just raise your hand if you've got one. I have plenty more, so don't let me keep going. Nobody. No takers.
Someone has to be the brave person. While people are thinking about their good question, I will share something that we alluded to earlier in the panel, which is what is public perception of higher education right now? Because we get this question quite a lot. We've been tracking just attitudes towards education and training beyond high school and a post-secondary degree for the better part of the last 25 or so years. And it's interesting because perceptions of higher education have changed dramatically, as most people assume, right, with enrollments declining and costs increasing. But most people still believe that education and training beyond high school is a sure path to a better job and a better life, as Scott was mentioning in his opening remarks. There are challenges that you just believe that the system is for someone else, that it's totally exclusive, elite. Varsity Blues didn't help much on this topic, right? We have this persona created of what an institution is, and it's a brick and mortar, traditional, elite, beautiful campus and quad, and most people feel like that's not for them. Tony mentioned this earlier, right? He said, if the brick and mortar is not for you, there's something else, but I think a lot of people think if the brick and mortar isn't for me, there's nothing else, and that feels like a fundamental change that's really going to affect actual public perception.
You know, I wonder, and please wave at me if you want to ask a question. I wonder, though, I hear from a lot of folks who work on serving adult working learners, that the traditional college image is still seared on so many people's brains. I mean, it's all we talk about pretty much. Yeah. You know, is that changing? Do you, again, to get to that traditional student who might be thinking twice right now about an ASU online or a WGU, I mean, how much are you seeing that
I do think we have to unremember some things that we have learned over the years as it relates to higher education. I'll use the rankings as an easy example, right? I actually don't really believe deeply in the rankings. I think there are a lot of problems with the rankings. I have fundamental concerns with them. And yet I looked this week when U.S. News and World Report released their most recent rankings at who's 1 through 100. And I looked, of course, for my alma mater first and foremost. So that's a problem, right? That even people like me who recognize the limitations, the challenges, and the problem that they've created in the market is still running and hitting Control F and looking for their own institution in that list. So I do think we need to kind of unlearn behaviors and associations that we have with higher education as an industry, and I think we're really far from getting there.
I would agree. Question in the back there.
I work primarily with teachers, and one of our main goal is to help teachers to be more intentional about how they serve their students. And the other gentleman was saying how a professor had this question about themselves, like, are they really effective? And so my question for you is, how do you create spaces and opportunities for the instructors to improve their own practice and to be reflective? What does that look like in WGU?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll give you what is likely going to be an unconventional answer to that. First and foremost, at WGU, one of the things that we have is a master curriculum, and so when you're serving 200,000 plus individuals in a year, we have to remove some of the variability in the competency-based model, meaning that in a master curriculum model, every one of the course instructors doesn't develop their own syllabus. They don't develop their own course content. They don't develop their own exams. They don't do that. What we do is say, well, if you're going to assess competency of every individual, you have to have the same kind of core and the same foundational course content, materials, everything else like that. You have to utilize a similar assessment so that we're assessing everyone against those standards that regardless of where you live and which course instructor you had, he's like, you all have to meet the standards for proficiency. For the course instructors that we have who are teaching those specific topical areas, we have actually instrumented so many of the interactions that the individual students have with their learning resources, the engagements with their course instructors, that what that's giving us is data that we can start looking at the efficacy of different practices in the teaching. We can start seeing whether different learning resources are increasing the actual learning of the students. So the course instructor now has data available to them to say, hey, of all the things I've done for my students, which ones are actually working as we're measuring learning as the core outcome that we're trying to drive? Now, reflective part of that too is like we do have hundreds and hundreds of course instructors. They are all given the autonomy to figure out how do they adapt to each individual. What we're trying to identify is from those course instructors, the feedback loop that comes back to say, hey, I've been trying this, and I've identified a pattern with my students that says this particular skill, this particular engagement is working really well. We want to actually identify those engagements and start surfacing them up as standards of practice. So we have a whole team that's centered around this notion. We even call it learner-centered faculty design. So that team is always looking at how are we surfacing new practices, engagements that's allowing us to increase the learning outcomes for students, and we can measure it. That is very different than, hey, I think it works, or I really liked how I delivered my lecture today. I had 800 faceless students in the audience, but I really felt good about my lecture. You're like, well, we want to measure whether you're feeling good about your lecture actually delivered learning for the individual. And that's a very different approach than most conventional models of it.
Just a last very quick question for you, Scott. I remember quite a few years ago moderating a panel with you and a bunch of journalists, and Mitch Daniels actually, and the WGU faculty model dominated the conversation to such a degree, I felt like I had to throw Mitch a question or two to bring him in. But can you just give folks a sense of the layers and how it works? Because if people don't know, I think it's a revolutionary concept that's got to be a big part of your success.
Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, in the competency-based educational model, when you're actually, back to this core point of you're trying to ensure that you have validated proficiency and competency of each individual student against the learning outcomes, those standards of learning. To do that in a very large-scale way, we wisely kind of double-clicked on the conventional faculty role and said, of all the things the faculty member does, when you intersect it with competency-based design, how would we rethink that? So we have that master curriculum. We have faculty members who focus on the design and development of that curriculum that's mapped to those learning outcomes, that map to the skill sets, et cetera. They're assessing all the different learning resources that we can license and utilize. They're designing the assessments, the full bank of questions and the performance versus objective assessment. They do all that work. By the way, that team is incredible because of also the technology and the design. Here's one simple factor I'll give you in that we think very differently about. Most regular and substantive interaction that's granted under higher education provisions means that a faculty delivered a lecture at least once a week. There's no consideration as to whether you actually measured the substantiveness of that lecture. And the other key thing is that we realize, well, delivering that lecture in a Netflix world, I can consume that lecture whenever I want. Why should I have to show up in a class to consume that lecture? If it's recorded, which so much is, why would I want to consume the best lectures to help students learn what they need to learn in that course? So that now you can source all of that content from the whole world of the best professors and the best producers of that, rather than a student being relegated to the faculty that's, that works for the institution. Like, no, we don't have that. So then we look at the instructional part of that, which is two parts of that. The mentor that's mentioned. This is an individual who has a master's degree or higher plus over 8 years of experience in the field of study. So if you're going to be in the technology field or business, et cetera, you're going to have a mentor that's with you from the start till the finish. They're providing all that augmented instruction. They're helping you deal with all the disruptions in your life, everything else like that, preparing you for your assessments. That's the person they come to know and love more than anyone else. Then you have a dedicated course instructor for every course in your program. These are the terminally degreed individuals who are the subject matter expert for any specific course. But here's the difference at WGU too. If I already have 10 years of experience like Tony likely did in certain areas, I'm going to accelerate through a course that may have taken me 2 weeks and I never talked to my course instructor because I already mastered that. But then I'm going to hit something else. All of a sudden I don't know anything about this thing. I'm talking to that course instructor at least twice a week. And I'm going into tutor sessions, et cetera. And then the last one is to ensure that those who design the curriculum and those who teach it are not the ones who are evaluating student performance. We also have evaluators who evaluate the students' performance on the assessments. So that integrity of the competency-based design is really important to us. When we, in all the OIG reviews, you probably remember, Paul, because you were still in the media world, is that they were looking at regular and substantive interaction, but they were looking at just the course instructor. But when you actually take the the full course instructor, program mentor, evaluator engagement that our students have, it was well over 120 substantive interactions per term. And I was joking to myself, it's like, I don't even think I had that many in my entire 4 years of school, you know, and like that amount of engagement that you have with faculty is so different in this online, you know, competency-based model.
Well, thank you. I really feel like if you don't understand that, oh, we do have one here. All right, last question here.
Awesome. Hi, hello, thank you. I'm going to switch it up entirely here. I work specifically with corporate leaders to help strengthen their talent practices to advance economic equitable mobility for their frontline workers. And I was wondering if Jens could specifically call out how corporate talent leaders can support student-centric models like WGU to advance their current and future working learners.
I may give a different answer than Stephanie will, but one of the things that is really needed is that skills-based approach even to the roles. So most people make this mistake of saying, well, what are all the capabilities I need in this role? Degree required. That, like, you have to actually be more specific than that. And there's two reasons for that. One is you really need to be able to identify the talent pools that you're going to seek. That you need to understand when it even comes to assessing and screening talent through that sourcing process and even into the hiring practices. You know, corporate leaders, employers, they really need to get much more sophisticated about how they're designing the skill sets they need. The other reason they need to do it is to significantly advance equity in employment. We're partnering with Opportunity at Work, who is, I think, doing a lot of great stuff around skilled through alternate routes. But they hold the same principle that we have at WGU, which is a working individual who has had years of experience. Guess what? They've acquired a lot of skills. But if you put degree required, you've automatically eliminated a huge population of workers that have the skill sets you need for your job. The other reason that's important to WGU is because we are a competency-based model. We don't actually care where you acquired the knowledge, skill, and ability that we're assessing your competency against. We don't care whether you sat with us for 3 months in a particular course and that's how you had to master it, or whether you already mastered it through work. We're going to assess and validate your competency in that, and you can do it really quickly. So I think from the corporate standpoint, the other thing is that you can more actively engage in designing the learning pathways that are going to be relevant to the workforce that you're trying to hire. I think of the McKinsey work that's done around, hey, what is it, 50, 65% of the jobs in the future haven't been defined yet. And I'm like, well, someone better get really busy defining them, because if you want talent to fill those roles, we better be able to start designing those learning pathways and those competency-based pathways to actually provide that talent. It's not like we're just going to show up there and realize, holy crap, I have all these new roles and none of you are skilled. So that to me is like a real problem right now. Well, if you want to solve that problem, the employers are in theory closer to the work than the institutions are. You have to be actively engaged in that. There is a lot of encouraging stuff that I think is happening with community colleges who are closer to that. They're thinking about the vocations they're developing and how do you define the skills. Most of them are not competency-based though. They're not skills architected. Those things have to also advance. So hopefully that answers your question, but I think it's a great one.
Yeah, I think it's a great question too, because you're also acknowledging that there's some responsibility on the employer side, right? That they do need to do more. I mean, I think the biggest thing that an employer can do is actually invest in additional education and training for their workforce. And that sounds really simplistic, but a lot of people actually don't provide that service at all. I'm sure in your work you find that a lot of employers don't invest in that additional education and training. And when we talk to some of them, because we have a really large employee engagement practice here at Gallup, we've been measuring employee engagement for the last 40 years. We ask them, why don't you offer additional education training? Why don't you have degree programs that you're funding or sponsoring? They say, well, I can't afford to essentially train these people for the streets, right? I can't afford to train them and invest in them so they can go to my competitor and create that value at that organization. But I would argue that if you're providing that value, they won't be leaving and taking to the streets, right? Because what most people don't realize is one of the most higher order elements of engagement for someone to stay at an organization, as measured by our employee engagement science and all of our competitors, is whether or not at work you have opportunities to learn and grow. Which doesn't mean you have to have opportunities at work to learn and grow at that employer. It just means you have to be having that experience while employed at that organization. And if you are, then people will generally stay at that organization longer term. And by the way, they'll be creating far more value for you. So I think employers need to kind of retrain how they think about training, right? It's not it's not a waste of money, right? Because you're not necessarily going to lose that person. In fact, that might be the only reason they stay at your organization long term, at a time where, by the way, that's all most employers care about, right, is employee retention when they're having such a hard time filling seats.
There's an interesting policy add to this one, which is how do you create greater employer participation in funding education? That is a untapped opportunity. The limits, for example, like 5250, I think is the limit in terms of education as a benefit, tax benefit, meaning if an employer provides it, it's a tax benefit to the employer providing that. It's interesting to consider is like, well, what if you doubled that? What if the larger participation is there? And I agree with Stephanie, which is if even the employers started turning their mindset to say the most valuable resource that they have, most valuable talent, the most valuable thing they have is the talent of their people, and you have to figure out how all those that you brought on the ground floor, how are you helping them develop up, et cetera. And if they move on to something else, like that's wonderful because your primary thing is you're helping your individual employees progress. If you just view them as widgets in cogs in a wheel, you're like, that's not a good mindset. I think more and more you have to realize that the talent is the most valuable thing you have, and we can incentivize employers to invest more heavily in that. That might change the nature of how institutions engage with employers when they're sitting on the hundreds of billions of dollars a year that's financing it versus federal student aid.
Well, I think with that, we'll wrap this panel. I want to thank our panelists and all of you for watching. Please give Scott and Co. a round of applause.